On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m. local time, the atomic bomb Little Boy detonated over Hiroshima, Japan, unleashing destruction unlike anything the world had ever seen. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, devastated Nagasaki. These two weapons killed over 200,000 people and forced Japan's surrender, ending World War II. Adolf Hitler said nothing when he learned about the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. He said nothing because he was dead. Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945, more than 3 months before the first atomic bomb was used in warfare. He died never knowing that the weapon he had once dismissed as Jewish physics would become the most powerful instrument of destruction ever created, or that the country he had allied with would be defeated by it. But the question, what would Hitler have said, is worth exploring, because it opens a window into one of history's great what-ifs. What if Germany had developed the atomic bomb first? What if Hitler had lived to see atomic weapons used? And what does the story of Germany's failed nuclear program tell us about how the Nazis approached science, warfare, and their own ideology? This is the story of Hitler's relationship with atomic physics, the German nuclear program during World War II, why it failed while America's succeeded, and what Hitler's reaction to atomic weapons might have been had he lived to see them used. To understand Hitler's potential reaction to atomic weapons, we must first understand his views on the physics that made them possible, and those views were shaped by Nazi ideology in ways that ultimately undermined German scientific efforts. In the 1920s and 1930s, Germany was at the forefront of theoretical physics. German scientists had made fundamental contributions to quantum mechanics and nuclear physics. Names like Max Planck, Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, and Max Born dominated the field. Albert Einstein, though he had emigrated to America, was German-born and had done much of his revolutionary work in Germany. But there was a problem from the Nazi perspective. Many of these scientists were Jewish or were associated with ideas that didn't fit Nazi ideology. Einstein was Jewish. Born was Jewish. The theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, and much of modern physics were denounced by Nazi ideologues as Jewish physics, Jüdische Physik, abstract, theoretical, and divorced from Aryan practical reality. Nazi ideology promoted what they called Deutsche Physik, German physics or Aryan physics, which was supposed to be grounded in experimental observation and practical application rather than abstract mathematical theory. This wasn't just academic debate. It became official policy that affected university appointments, research funding, and scientific education. Hitler personally had little interest in theoretical science and didn't understand the physics involved in nuclear fission. His interests lay in engineering, architecture, and military technology that he could immediately visualize and understand. Tanks, aircraft, massive buildings, and wonder weapons like rockets. Abstract concepts like quantum mechanics or nuclear chain reactions were beyond his comprehension and interest. When advisors tried to explain nuclear physics to Hitler, he reportedly became bored or dismissive. The theoretical nature of the work, the uncertain timeline for practical applications, and the association with Jewish physics all made him skeptical. He wanted weapons that could be built now, not theoretical possibilities that might work in the future. This attitude would have profound consequences for Germany's nuclear program. Germany actually had a head start on atomic research. Nuclear fission was discovered in Berlin in December 1938 by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, with theoretical work by Lise Meitner, who had fled Nazi Germany because she was Jewish. This discovery that uranium atoms could be split, releasing enormous energy, was the foundation for all subsequent nuclear weapons development. When World War II began in September 1939, the German Army Ordnance Office quickly organized a research program to investigate whether nuclear fission could be weaponized. The program, codenamed the Uranium Club, Uranverein, brought together Germany's top nuclear physicists, including Werner Heisenberg, who would become the scientific leader of the project. On paper, Germany had significant advantages. They had discovered fission first. They had excellent scientists, including several Nobel Prize winners. They controlled territory with uranium deposits, Czechoslovakia. They had access to heavy water from occupied Norway. They had a sophisticated scientific and industrial infrastructure. Yet the German nuclear program never came close to building an atomic bomb. By 1945, when the war ended, German scientists had not achieved a sustained nuclear chain reaction, had not built a functioning nuclear reactor, and were nowhere near designing an actual weapon. Why did the German program fail while the American Manhattan Project succeeded? The reasons are multiple and interconnected. The German nuclear program was never given the massive resources that the Manhattan Project received. The Americans spent $2 billion, about 30 billions in today's dollars, and employed over 130,000 people at facilities across the country. The German program received a fraction of those resources. Hitler and the Nazi leadership never fully committed to the nuclear program. They were focused on weapons that could be deployed quickly: rockets, jets, new tanks, and submarines. A weapon that might take 5 or 10 years to develop, with uncertain prospects for success, didn't interest them. Werner Heisenberg, brilliant as he was, proved to be a poor leader for a weapons program. He was a theoretical physicist, not an engineer or project manager. He didn't have the vision or organizational skills that someone like J. Robert Oppenheimer brought to the Manhattan Project. More critically, the German program was fragmented. Different organizations, the Army, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, universities, and industrial firms, all pursued separate approaches with minimal coordination. There was no centralized effort like the Manhattan Project's unified command structure. Nazi racial policies had driven away many of Germany's best scientists. Einstein, Meitner, Born, and dozens of other brilliant physicists had fled Germany. Many ended up working for the Allies, including on the Manhattan Project. Germany had cut off its own scientific talent pipeline. The Nazi campaign against Jewish physics undermined scientific education and research. Universities had to toe the party line on what constituted acceptable science. Bright students were discouraged from pursuing theoretical physics. The entire scientific culture was poisoned by ideology. Allied bombing raids disrupted German research facilities and industrial production. The heavy water plant in Norway, critical for certain reactor designs, was sabotaged by Norwegian resistance fighters backed by British intelligence. Germany's scientific infrastructure was under constant attack. There is ongoing debate about whether Heisenberg deliberately sabotaged the German program or simply made critical errors in his calculations. Heisenberg calculated that building an atomic bomb would require tons of enriched uranium, making it impractical. The correct calculation, which the Americans made, showed that much less material was needed, making a bomb feasible. Did Heisenberg make an honest mistake, or did he deliberately overestimate the requirements to discourage the Nazi leadership from pursuing the weapon? We may never know for certain, but the effect was the same. German leaders were told atomic bombs were impractical, and they believed it. While the nuclear program languished, Hitler poured resources into other wonder weapons, Wunderwaffen, that he believed would turn the tide of the war. These weapons aligned with his preferences. They were visible, dramatic, and didn't require understanding complex physics. A pulse jet-powered cruise missile that could strike London and other Allied cities. Hitler loved the idea of terror bombing and retaliation. Thousands were produced and launched. The world's first ballistic missile, designed by Wernher von Braun. Hitler was fascinated by rocketry and devoted enormous resources to the V-2 program, even as the military situation became desperate. The V-2 killed thousands of civilians, but had minimal military impact. It cost more to build than the damage it caused. Germany developed the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Hitler initially insisted it be modified as a bomber rather than used as a fighter, delaying its effective deployment. Hitler obsessed over massive tanks like the Maus and the Panzer VIII, which were impractical and consumed resources that could have been used for more conventional weapons. These projects shared common characteristics. Hitler could visualize them. They produced dramatic effects, and they appealed to his ego and his belief in technological superiority. A nuclear bomb, which existed only in equations and required years of patient research, held no such appeal. Let's engage in a thought experiment. What if the German nuclear program had succeeded? What if, by 1943 or 1944, Germany had developed an atomic bomb? How would Hitler have used it, and what would it have meant for the war? First, it's important to understand that Hitler likely would have used atomic weapons immediately and without hesitation. He had already demonstrated willingness to use terror weapons against civilians. The V-1 and V-2 were explicitly designed to terrorize civilian populations. He had approved the use of chemical weapons in concentration camps. He had no moral qualms about mass civilian casualties. If Germany had possessed atomic bombs, probable targets would have included London, the symbolic and political capital of Britain, already under sustained attack from V-weapons. An atomic bomb on London would have killed hundreds of thousands and potentially forced British surrender. Moscow. Destroying the Soviet capital and decapitating Soviet leadership might have crippled the Red Army's command structure. Major Soviet cities. Stalingrad, Leningrad, or other cities could have been destroyed to break Soviet morale and industrial capacity. Invasion beaches. If Germany had atomic bombs by 1944, they might have used them against the D-Day invasion forces, potentially destroying the entire Allied landing force. Would it have changed the outcome? This is the critical question. Would atomic weapons have allowed Germany to win World War II? The answer is probably no, though they would have made the war longer and bloodier. By the time Germany could realistically have developed atomic weapons, late 1944 or 1945 at the earliest, the strategic situation was already hopeless. Germany was being invaded from both east and west. German industry was being destroyed by strategic bombing. Germany lacked the resources to continue the war indefinitely. The Allies had overwhelming numerical superiority. Even with atomic weapons, Germany would have faced several problems. Delivery systems. Germany would need ways to deliver atomic bombs to targets. Their bombers had limited range and were increasingly vulnerable to Allied fighters. The V-2 rocket couldn't carry a nuclear payload with 1940s technology. Atomic bombs were too heavy. Limited production. Germany would have been able to produce only a handful of atomic bombs, given resource constraints. The Allies could absorb even devastating losses to a few cities and continue fighting. Retaliation. If Germany used atomic weapons, the Allies, who would soon develop their own, might have responded with even more devastating attacks. The logic of mutually assured destruction would have applied. Political factors. Using atomic weapons on Allied cities might have hardened Allied resolve rather than breaking it. The British withstood the Blitz. They might have endured even atomic attacks rather than surrender to Nazis. Still, atomic weapons in German hands would have been catastrophic. Millions more might have died. The war could have dragged on into 1946 or beyond. And there's always the possibility that some unpredictable event, political collapse in Britain or the Soviet Union, war weariness in America, might have given Germany breathing room. To understand what Hitler might have said about atomic weapons, we need to understand his mental state in his final weeks and what he did say about the weapons available to him. By April 1945, Hitler was a broken man living in a fantasy world. The Thousand-Year Reich was collapsing around him. Soviet forces were blocks away from his bunker. His hands shook from Parkinson's disease. He was addicted to drugs administered by his personal physician. He rarely slept. His rages were more frequent and less rational. Yet even in these final days, Hitler clung to delusions. He spoke of miracle weapons that would still save Germany. He moved non-existent armies on maps, giving orders to units that had been destroyed weeks earlier. He blamed everyone but himself, the generals, the German people, the Jews, fate, for Germany's defeat. Hitler's final recorded statements show a man consumed by bitterness and thoughts of destruction. In his political testament, dictated on April 29th, the day before his suicide, he blamed the war on international Jewry and called for the German people to continue fighting. He showed no remorse, no recognition of the suffering he had caused, no humanity. He ordered that Berlin be defended to the last, even though this meant the city and its remaining population would be destroyed. He approved the flooding of the Berlin subway system, drowning hundreds of civilians and wounded soldiers sheltering there. In his final hours, he married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, had his dog Blondie poisoned to test his cyanide capsules, and then shot himself while Eva took poison. This was Hitler's final act, a selfish, cowardly suicide that left his followers to face the consequences of his actions. Given what we know about Hitler's personality, his views on science and warfare, and his mental state in 1945, what might he have said if he had somehow lived to learn about the atomic bombs dropped on Japan? Scenario 1. Hitler in captivity. If Hitler had been captured alive rather than committing suicide, he might have learned about Hiroshima and Nagasaki while in Allied custody. His reaction would likely have been initial disbelief. Hitler might not have believed the reports initially. He was prone to dismissing information that contradicted his worldview. He might have thought it was Allied propaganda. Rage at his scientists. Once convinced the bombs were real, Hitler would likely have blamed Heisenberg and the other German physicists for failing to develop atomic weapons. In Hitler's mind, Germany's defeat was always someone else's fault. My scientists failed me would have been his explanation, and not, I failed to support them. Rationalization. Hitler might have argued that atomic weapons proved his point about the barbarism of the Allies, conveniently forgetting his own plans for genocide and his willingness to use any weapon available. He would have betrayed himself as a victim of Allied aggression. Envy and resentment. Hitler would have been consumed by envy that his enemies had achieved what he could not. This would have fed into his existing resentments and his tendency to blame others for his failures. No remorse. There's no reason to believe Hitler would have expressed any sympathy for the Japanese civilians killed by atomic bombs. He showed no empathy for the millions killed in his own concentration camps. He wouldn't suddenly develop compassion for Japanese victims. Scenario 2. Hitler learning about the bombs before his death. If Hitler had somehow learned about the Manhattan Project before his suicide, perhaps through intelligence reports or captured documents, his reaction might have been dismissal. He likely would have dismissed it as impossible, based on the advice of his own scientists who had told him atomic bombs were impractical. Jewish physics could not possibly work. Panic. Alternatively, if he believed the reports, he might have panicked, recognizing that the Allies possessed a weapon against which Germany had no defense. This might have accelerated his decision to commit suicide. Blame. He would have blamed his scientists, his generals, and the German people for failing to develop atomic weapons first. Personal responsibility was foreign to Hitler's psychology. Final delusions. In his delusional state in April 1945, Hitler might have convinced himself that Germany would develop atomic weapons at the last moment and still win the war. He was capable of spectacular self-deception. We actually have fascinating evidence about how German nuclear scientists reacted to the news of Hiroshima. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, British intelligence secretly detained 10 top German nuclear scientists at a country house called Farm Hall in England. The house was bugged, and all their conversations were recorded without their knowledge. On August 6, 1945, the scientists were informed about the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Their reactions, captured on the secret recordings, are revealing. Werner Heisenberg. Initially didn't believe it was an atomic bomb, thinking it might be exaggerated propaganda. When convinced it was real, he was shocked and depressed. Over the next few days, he tried to calculate how the Americans had done it, eventually realizing his own calculations had been wrong. Otto Hahn, who discovered fission, was devastated and contemplated suicide. He felt personally responsible for the deaths at Hiroshima and the development of atomic weapons. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker discussed the moral implications and tried to rationalize why the German program had failed. The recordings revealed that the German scientists had convinced themselves during the war that atomic bombs were impractical and couldn't be built in wartime. Learning that the Americans had succeeded shocked them and forced them to confront their own failure. Interestingly, the scientists initially tried to save face by suggesting they had deliberately sabotaged the program or hadn't tried very hard to build bombs because they didn't want Hitler to have them. Later evidence suggests this was post hoc rationalization. They had tried to build atomic weapons but failed due to errors, lack of resources, and organizational problems. While Hitler was dead, other Nazi leaders who survived might have offered insights into how the Nazi hierarchy would have reacted to atomic weapons. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, later wrote extensively about Nazi Germany. He was educated enough to understand the significance of atomic weapons and pragmatic enough to recognize they represented a new era in warfare. Speer might have argued that atomic weapons validated his concerns about Hitler's strategic decisions and the Nazi regime's failure to fully mobilize for total war. until too late. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, survived to stand trial at Nuremberg. Göring might have seen atomic weapons as vindication of strategic bombing doctrine, the idea that air power alone could win wars. He also might have been envious that the Americans developed a weapon more destructive than anything his Luftwaffe had deployed. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, might have viewed atomic weapons through the lens of racial ideology, perhaps arguing they were another example of how the struggle between races had become a fight for survival or extinction. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister who died with Hitler in the bunker, might have recognized atomic weapons as the ultimate propaganda tool, a weapon that could terrorize entire populations into submission. It's worth noting that Japan and Germany shared intelligence throughout the war, though not always completely. Japan was pursuing its own nuclear program, though it was even less successful than Germany's. The two Axis powers communicated about technological developments, but this communication was limited and often delayed. There's no evidence that Hitler knew about Japan's nuclear research or that he thought atomic weapons were imminent. If he had known Japan was researching atomic weapons, he might have pushed Germany's program harder, driven by competition with his ally. Hitler was often motivated by rivalry and one-upmanship, even with supposed friends. The irony is profound. Germany and Japan, allied in war, were both trying to develop atomic weapons. Germany failed and surrendered before seeing atomic weapons used. Japan failed and became the only nation to experience atomic attack. The weapon neither could build, destroyed one, and might have destroyed the other if the war had continued. Let's imagine a scenario where Hitler somehow survives beyond April 30th, 1945. Perhaps he escapes Berlin, perhaps he's captured alive, perhaps he lives in hiding. What would his reaction have been to the news from Hiroshima? The public statement. If Hitler were in a position to make public statements, he would likely have condemned the atomic bombings as American barbarism and war crimes. This would be complete hypocrisy given his own crimes, but Hitler was a master propagandist who never let facts constrain his rhetoric. He might have said something like, "The Americans have shown their true nature by using this terrible weapon against defenseless Japanese cities. This proves that the Allies fight without honor, attacking women and children. The German people were right to resist these barbarians to the end." The private reaction. Privately, Hitler's reaction would likely have been different. He would have been jealous. The Americans had achieved what he could not. Angry. His scientists had failed him, his allies had been defeated, and he had lost the race to develop the ultimate weapon. Calculating. He would immediately think about how atomic weapons would have changed his strategy. Could he have won if Germany had developed them first? Could he have held out longer? Could he have forced better surrender terms? Defensive. He would blame everyone but himself. The scientists who failed, the generals who lost the war, the German people who supposedly weren't worthy of him. The psychological impact. Learning about atomic weapons would have been a profound psychological blow to Hitler. His entire worldview was based on willpower, racial superiority, and the power of the German spirit. Atomic weapons represented pure material power, physics and engineering, not ideology or will. The weapon that ended the war was created largely by Jewish scientists. Many of the Manhattan Project's key figures were Jewish refugees from Nazi Europe, using Jewish physics. Einstein's theories were fundamental to nuclear physics. This would have been an unbearable irony for Hitler. The very people and ideas he despised had created the ultimate weapon. The fact that Hitler never obtained atomic weapons is one of the most consequential outcomes of World War II. If Germany had developed atomic bombs first, the history of the 20th century would have been radically different and almost certainly worse. Several factors prevented Hitler from getting the bomb. Timing. The war ended before anyone could build atomic weapons. Germany would have needed at least until late 1945 or 1946 to develop a bomb, even under the most optimistic scenarios. Allied victory. Germany's military defeat made their nuclear program impossible to complete. Resources, facilities, and scientists were all disrupted by the collapse of the Nazi state. Allied intelligence. The Allies knew about German nuclear research and specifically targeted it. The raid on the Norwegian heavy water plant, the capture of German scientists and materials, and the bombing of research facilities all hampered the program. Nazi ideology. The Nazis' own ideology undermined their scientific efforts, driving away Jewish scientists, denigrating Jewish physics, and prioritizing ideology over pragmatic research all damaged Germany's nuclear program. Hitler's disinterest. Hitler personally never made atomic weapons a priority. If he had given the nuclear program the same resources and attention he gave to rockets or jet fighters, Germany might have made more progress. Luck. There was an element of luck involved. If Otto Hahn had discovered fission 2 years earlier, if Heisenberg had made different calculations, if the war had lasted longer, any of these might have changed the outcome. The failure of the German nuclear program, while fortunate for humanity, also meant that Hitler never had to confront the weapon that represented everything he despised, a product of international science, theoretical physics, and Jewish intellectual contributions. The story of Hitler and atomic weapons, or rather, the lack of such weapons, teaches several important lessons. 1. Science requires freedom. The German nuclear program failed partly because Nazi ideology interfered with scientific work. Good science requires freedom of inquiry, international collaboration, and respect for evidence over ideology. Authoritarian regimes that try to control science often undermine their own capabilities. Short-term thinking loses wars. Hitler's focus on immediate results and his disinterest in long-term research projects was strategic short-sightedness. The Manhattan Project required years of work with no guarantee of success. Hitler wanted wonder weapons he could deploy next month, not technologies that might work in 5 years. 3. Moral luck sometimes matters. We were lucky that Hitler didn't get atomic weapons before the Allies did. If the timing had been different, if German scientists had been more successful, if the war had lasted longer, the outcome could have been catastrophic. Sometimes history turns on luck as much as skill or virtue. The danger of ideological science. The Nazi campaign against Jewish physics seriously damaged German scientific capabilities. When ideology trumps evidence, when political correctness of any kind interferes with objective research, progress suffers. This lesson applies across political spectrums and time periods. If individual decisions matter, Heisenberg's calculations, whether wrong by mistake or deliberately sabotaged, may have saved the world from Nazi atomic weapons. Einstein's letter to Roosevelt helped start the Manhattan Project. Individual scientists making individual decisions had enormous historical consequences. Adolf Hitler said nothing when the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan because he was dead. having committed suicide 3 months earlier. But his silence on this world-changing event is itself eloquent. Hitler's death before the atomic age began meant he never had to confront the failure of his ideology in the face of this ultimate weapon. He never had to acknowledge that Jewish physics worked, that international scientific cooperation produced results his nationalistic approach couldn't match, and that the very people he tried to exterminate had helped create the weapon that ended his empire. If Hitler had lived, his reaction to atomic weapons would likely have combined denial, rage, envy, and self-justification, the same psychological mechanisms he used throughout his life to avoid confronting reality. He would have found ways to blame everyone but himself, to rationalize Germany's failure, and to maintain his delusions of superiority, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. But history spared Hitler this final humiliation. He died in his bunker, deluded to the end, believing he would be remembered as a great leader betrayed by lesser men. He never knew that the weapon that would symbolize the post-war world was built by refugees from his regime, using physics he had dismissed, embodying values he had rejected. The atomic bomb that fell on Hiroshima was, in a sense, the final judgment on Hitler's ideology. Science, international cooperation, and respect for human talent, regardless of ethnic or religious background, had triumphed. Hitler's vision of a racially pure empire sustained by willpower and military might had been proven bankrupt. What would Hitler have said? We'll never know. But his silence, the silence of death and defeat, may be the most fitting answer of all. He died without seeing the atomic age he might have started, without confronting the weapon he might have used, without facing the ultimate proof that his ideology had failed. In the end, Hitler said nothing about the atomic bomb. And perhaps that absence, that final silence, tells us more about the man and his legacy than any words he might have spoken. The world was lucky that Hitler never obtained atomic weapons, lucky that he died before seeing them used, and lucky that the scientists who built them were working for the defeat of everything he represented. That luck, combined with the courage and sacrifice of millions who fought against Nazi Germany, ensured that the atomic age would begin in the hands of democracies rather than dictatorships. It's a sobering reminder that the race to develop new technologies is never purely scientific or technical. It's also political, moral, and deeply human. The story of Hitler and the atomic bomb is ultimately a story about how humanity avoided one nightmare, Nazi atomic weapons, only to face another, the nuclear age. But it's also a story about how freedom, science, and human cooperation can triumph over tyranny, ideology, and hatred. Hitler's silence on the atomic bomb is permanent, but the questions his hypothetical reaction raises about science and ideology, about the relationship between knowledge and power, about moral luck and historical contingency, continue to echo through our time, reminding us of how close the world came to a far darker outcome, and how the choices we make about science and technology can shape the future of humanity.